Good morning, everyone. Our second screencast on World War One, and really our last screencast on World War One, is going to focus on Wilson's 14 points, the Treaty of Versailles, and the Paris Peace Conference of 1919. So, prior to, even prior to the conference, the Paris Peace Conference, Woodrow Wilson, our president at the time, is going to kind of spell out his plan for peace, really, and keeping peace in the world. And so he makes a speech to Congress, and he kind of spells out like his points. And he even illuminates this before the United States gets into the war in 1916 and 1917 about kind of his plans for keeping the world safe for democracy and keeping peace in the world in general. But then he really kind of spells out his plan, and it becomes known as his 14 points because there's really 14 aspects of Wilson's whole plan to peace. So he's going to kind of bring this peace plan to Paris, and he's going to go personally. The first United States president to ever kind of go to Europe personally to kind of negotiate uh, any type of treaty or any type of negotiation. And he's going to kind of meet with the other European leaders at this Paris Peace Conference after World War One. Now, Bolshevik Russia, the new Russian communist Russia state, they're not invited to the peace conference, and neither is Germany. So it's really the Allies kind of deciding what to do with Europe and how to kind of divide it up and what plans are they going to make for Europe. So I really like this quote. It's probably my favorite quote, one of my favorite quotes in history. One of the British representative at the Paris Peace Conference is a guy named Lloyd George, and what he says, he's asked about the Paris Peace Conference, and he asked kind of how did it go afterwards. And what he says is not badly, considering I was seated between Jesus Christ and Napoleon. Now, who is he referring to as Jesus Christ, and who is he referring to as Napoleon? Well, Napoleon he's referring to the French representative, which is a guy named George Clemenceau, and his nickname was the Tiger, because he really goes in there and he kind of wants to really punish Germany for their actions during World War One. Now he's referring to Wilson when he says Jesus Christ, because Wilson, as we know, kind of puts his morals into his foreign policy, and he's really kind of moralizing here with the 14 points and trying to almost preach in a way about how the world's supposed to be and how it's supposed to be kind of set up. So the actual product of the Paris Peace Conference is going to be the Treaty of Versailles, which is very different from Wilson's 14 points. But I just want to quickly look at Wilson's 14 points to kind of get an idea of what Wilson wanted and what did they actually accept in the peace treaty, and then what does America think about Wilson's 14 points and the Treaty of Versailles itself, because they're not coincided. Wilson does not discuss this with Congress, which is largely a Republican Congress at the time, and Wilson is a Democrat. So he doesn't discuss this with Congress before he leaves and he goes on this trip. It's kind of his plan, and in America, he can't make these treaties on his own. He's going to have to get Congress to sign off on this. The Senate has to approve all international treaties. And so, although he's going out there and he's our representative, he really has somebody else that he has to answer to when he comes back to the United States. So let's kind of look through Wilson's 14 points quickly. So we're only going to look through an abbreviated list of this, not all 14. So number one, no more secret agreements here. So with Wilson's 14 points, he's trying to address some of the major causes of World War I. So what he's really referring to here is the secret alliances that were formed, primarily between Germany and Austria, and something known as the blank check that Germany kind of issued Austria prior to World War I, saying that they would back them up no matter what. And we talked about this in class, that these alliances really kind of is one of the big reasons why this erupts into a world war, and it brings more and more people in. And so he's trying to say here, like, listen, no more secret alliances, no more secret agreements between countries. Next thing, this is really addressing primarily an American concern, for free navigation of the seas. And this is kind of referring to the British mining of the North Sea during the war, and also specifically the submarine warfare of the Germans. And he kind of wants to end these restrictions and kind of let the sea be open, and so that you can navigate anywhere and you can trade anywhere in the world. And you can see kind of traditional American thought here as far as, opening up the world to trade and opening up, kind of cutting down these boundaries around the world. And he kind of extends this with an end to all economic barriers between different countries. So he's talking really about tariffs and trades and things like that, and kind of allowing people to trade more freely in the world. And he thinks that this will kind of promote peace because If your trading partners and your economic partners, you're going to be less inclined to want to fight with each other. So this is kind of a precursor. I mean, he's far ahead of his time here, but a precursor of things like the European Union that breaks down all trade barriers and economic barriers and organizations like that. And this is what Wilson is kind of foreseeing at the time. His next big thing is to kind of reduce weapons and reduce armaments. So he wants everybody to kind of bring their armies, lower their level of their armies, lower their armaments to an even balance and a very low balance, so that no country is more powerful than another country. And if they're all kind of low, they're going to be less inclined to fight and less inclined to kind of try and show off. Because remember, we talked about militarism as a big cause of World War I. His next one is to kind of limit colonial gains and try and not necessarily give up. I put give up all overseas colonies, but not necessarily give them all up, but to kind of slowly kind of transition away from creating these empires, because the empires create imbalance in the world. And they also directly contrast with one of Wilson's big points is the self-determination in the world. And so he's really kind of against having these big, massive overseas colonies and these big empires for everyone, not just the people who lose. And this last one, which is a big one for Wilson, he kind of spells it out in a number of different places, is self-determination for all people. So having self-determination, which means the right to choose as an ethnic group who you want to rule you, what type of government you want to have, whether you want to be democracy, a monarchy, communism, having that right to choose, that self-determination as an ethnic group and as a group of people all across the world. So he's calling for very lofty ideals here with self-determination. You can look back to some of the causes of World War I, why the Serbians trying to get a greater Serbia and assassinating the Archduke Franz Ferdinand. And so some of these big reasons for why you might want self-determination. Now, he's calling for very lofty ideals here. To varying degrees, they're going to accept them or reject them. Self-determination, in certain cases, they do accept it. But most of Wilson's 14 points, they do not accept. They're not going to give up all of their colonies. They're not going to reduce their armaments. They're not going to end all trade restrictions. They're not going to have free, open navigation of the seas. So a lot of his ideas, they don't accept, and they kind of put them up as too moral and too lofty of an ideal that Wilson's trying to translate. And it's why Lloyd George calls him Jesus Christ after the conference, because he's trying to put up these morals here which they think are really just unattainable and not realistic. And you also have to keep in mind that the British and the French, they win. They don't want to give up all of their colonies. They don't want to necessarily cede things that they believe should be theirs as the victors. And so Wilson, he has good ideals here, but he has his own agenda for them, and they also are not going to be fully accepted. Now, his last point here, the creation of the League of Nations, is something that he wants to do to kind of create an international police force to have, or international organization to kind of try and keep the peace in the world. Now, he wants this. Now, this actually gets put into the Treaty of Versailles, the League of Nations. But this is going to be one of the most contentious points that's going to be argued in the United States about, whether the United States should sign the treaty because of the League of Nations. And so the League of Nations is going to be a very decisive part of this whole conversation in the United States. Once the treaty comes back to the Senate, it's going to be debated in the Senate. Now, the actual Treaty of Versailles, as many of you should know, is very harsh on Germany. They have to accept full war guilt for the war. They have to pay huge war reparations. They have to give up all of their colonies. They have to reduce their military. They can't have tanks. They can't have an air force. They can't have a lot of things that a country would need to kind of defend itself. And so they're going to have to accept full responsibility for this war. And so this is not Wilson's plan. When Germany signs the armistice in 1918, they kind of have Wilson's 14 points in mind as the peace agreement. But the British and the French don't necessarily have that same agreement in mind. So Wilson's ideas do not really get put into practice in a big way in the Treaty of Versailles. Now, to kind of flip this in a more American way and look at what's going on back home, there is big opposition to the treaty. Although a lot of people are in favor of it, popularly in favor of the Treaty of Versailles, the place that it matters is going to be within the Senate, and the Senate's going to have a lot of issues with the treaty. So you have two groups that are going to speak out against this. You're going to have the irreconcilables and the reservationists. So the irreconcilables here in Congress and in the Senate are going to be people who are against it. They're both against it because of the League of Nations, but for different reasons. So the irreconcilables here, they're going to be against it because they feel like this League of Nations is going to be used to kind of advance imperialistic aims of the Europeans and other other countries outside of the United States. And the reservationists here, they're going to be against it because they feel like the Treaty of Versailles is going to kind of, and especially specifically the League of Nations, is going to drag the United States into overseas conflicts and European entanglements that they don't want to be involved in. So think kind of like George Washington saying, don't get involved in these foreign entanglements. And that's what the reservationists are weary of kind of being dragged into the conflict. So as a result of this kind of this negativity about the treaty within Congress, the treaty is not going to get passed. The Treaty of Versailles is not going to get passed in the United States, and we do not sign the Treaty of Versailles because it's never ratified by the Senate. So there's actual arguments against the treaty in the United States, specifically the League of Nations, but there's also politics going on here. Wilson was a Democratic president, and he kind of tried to use 14 points as a political tool to get Democrats elected prior to him going to Paris. Now the complete opposite happened. Republicans get elected into the Senate, and they control the Senate and the House at the time. And so there's a bit of politics going on here between Republicans and Democrats as to why they don't want to get the treaty signed. He does not bring Republicans into his inner circle to kind of create the 14 points or be a part of his advisory board. And so, again, you have kind of partisan politics playing into the American sphere here and really kind of hurting getting this treaty signed. So, in the long run, you might say like the Treaty of Versailles is, I believe, not, obviously not the best treaty, and it's one of the leading causes of World War II in general. But none of the reasons that you might think for why the United States doesn't sign the Treaty of Versailles are the reasons for why we don't sign it. It's not because it punishes Germany. It's not because it makes them pay huge war reparations and take away their colonies and basically completely demoralizes Germany and puts the whole blame on them. It's much more because of this League of Nations. And you have to think traditional American foreign policy when you think about why the United States might be against something known as the League of Nations and kind of being drawn into foreign conflicts at the time. Alright guys, so this is going to be our last one on World War I. We're going to start up with the 1920s tomorrow. Me and Mr. Dumpy are going to do something a little bit different. We're actually going to kind of trade off doing screencasts for the next couple of days. So actually tomorrow you're going to be watching Mr. Dumpy do a screencast basically on the first 10 pages of chapter 24 on the 1920s. And then I'll be back for the next 10 pages or so, and then Mr. Dumpy for the end. So we figure we give you guys a little bit different look and kind of break it up a little bit for all of you. Alright, so see you guys tomorrow.